In every decade, Hollywood sells us the same comforting illusion, that what we see on the screen is the whole story. Bright explosions, heroic poses, posters that shout louder than the truth. But somewhere behind those frames, in cutting rooms that never see daylight, there are reels that were trimmed, rewritten, or quietly buried, so no one would ever ask what really happened. In the early 80s, when Cold War paranoia still hummed in the background and action cinema was turning violence into spectacle, a different kind of battle was happening off-camera. Low-budget crews shot through the night. Scripts changed on the spot. Directors lost control of their own films, and studios pulled scenes out like loose threads, afraid of what might unravel if the full version reached the audience. What survived on screen often looked chaotic, campy, or disposable. But underneath the rough edges, these films carried something raw, a kind of accidental honesty about power, fear, revenge, and the country that produced them. This is not a story about perfect masterpieces. It is about movies that were stitched together out of panic and compromise. Movies that tried to say more than they were allowed to, and then were pushed aside when they came too close to something real. Somewhere between vigilante fantasies, jungle war, nightmares, silent monsters, and invasions staged on American soil, you can still feel the nervous hands of the people who tried to reshape them. These are 5 films. Hollywood never expected you to look at this closely. 5 reels, where the cuts say as much as the images that remain. Film 1, The Exterminator 21984. There are films that lose a few scenes in the edit. And then there is The Exterminator 2, a movie that returned from the cutting room as a ghost of what it once was. What audiences saw in 1984 was not the film its cast and crew believed they were making. It was the remains of a production reshaped by fear, studio interference, and a desperate attempt to control a story that seemed to be slipping away. On the surface, it looked like a simple follow-up to a gritty vigilante hit. Robert Ginty returned as John Eastland, the welder turned urban avenger, while Christopher George delivered his final performance before his own silent departure. The promise was clear: bigger action, darker streets. A sequel that pushed the vigilante fantasy to its limit. Promotional materials teased a brutal showdown against gang violence and corruption, an urban war lit by fire and revenge. But behind the camera, Cannon Films was fighting its own private battle. Early cuts of the film were judged unusable, triggering emergency reshoots that dramatically altered the story. Stunt scenes were rebuilt, characters rewritten, and entire sequences vanished without explanation. Jean-Marie Palardy, brought in at the 11th hour, reshot large portions of the movie without official credit, creating a hybrid film where tones, costumes, even actors' hair lengths shifted from shot to shot. Rumors persist of a lost original version, longer, harsher, more coherent, buried somewhere in Cannon's forgotten archives. In the end, The Exterminator 2 became a patchwork of 2 different films stitched together under pressure. What survived is messy, fractured, but strangely revealing. A reminder that sometimes the most honest truth isn't in the footage that remains, but in the footage someone tried to erase. Film 2, Strike Commando, 1987. Some films hide their secrets under polish and precision. One, Strike Commando does the opposite. It wears its chaos openly, like shrapnel lodged just beneath the skin. What began as another low-budget attempt to ride the global wave of post-Rambo fever slowly transformed into a testament to how far a production can drift once the cameras start rolling faster than the script can keep up. The story seemed straightforward enough. Reb Brown, the explosive, larger-than-life soldier sent into a jungle nightmare torn between loyalty, betrayal, and brutal survival. Bruno, Mattei, and Claudio Fragasso, 2 names synonymous with Italian exploitation, crafted a film that promised unrestrained action, booming monologues, and the kind of emotional sincerity that feels both exaggerated and strangely genuine. For audiences, it was advertised as a raw jungle war epic, an adrenaline-driven descent into chaos with a hero who refused to break. But the hidden truth lies in how the film was actually made. Scripts were rewritten nightly, sometimes hourly. Scenes were shot before anyone fully understood what their narrative purpose would be. Explosions were reused for efficiency. Dialogue was recorded with the hope it could be retrofitted into whatever story emerged in the editing room. Multiple cuts circulated in different markets, each with alternate scenes, altered violence, or entirely rearranged sequences. Whispers of an earlier, more cohesive edit persist, though no definitive version has ever surfaced. And throughout it all, Matei's signature method loomed. Shoot fast, cut faster. Trust that the final patchwork will survive on sheer intensity alone. In the end, Strike. Commando became more than its production flaws. It became a collage of instinct and improvisation, a film held together by its own reckless momentum. And in that fractured energy lies the accidental confession of exploitation cinema. Sometimes, chaos isn't a problem to hide. It is the story itself. Film 3. Silent Rage. 1982. There is something unnerving about a film that seems unsure of its own identity. A movie caught between genres like a heartbeat skipping out of rhythm. Silent Rage is exactly that, a collision of slasher horror and stoic action, stitched together around a central figure who rarely speaks but always commands the frame. Chuck Norris. To audiences in 1982. It was marketed as another tough guy thriller, a small-town showdown between a sheriff and a killer. But beneath that simple selling point was a film wrestling with far more than it revealed. On its surface, the story circles around John Kirby, a man whose violent breakdown leads to his revival through an experimental serum. What returns is something stronger, faster, and nearly unstoppable. A creation the film never fully labels, but clearly fears. Norris plays Sheriff Steve Carson, with his signature calm, offering a grounded presence against the rising terror. The marketing leaned heavily on his name, suggesting a straightforward action piece where justice meets brute force. What viewers didn't expect was a creeping atmosphere of dread, nighttime sequences that feel lifted from classic horror, and a villain whose silence is more chilling than any roar. But behind the scenes, the hidden truth was friction, creative uncertainty, shifting tones, and a studio unsure how to sell a film that refused to fit neatly into one box. Insiders described debates over how much horror to allow, how much action to reinsert, and how far to push the science fiction elements. Several scenes were trimmed or softened to avoid leaning too heavily toward either genre. The result is a film that feels like two visions, coexisting uneasily, each interrupting the other. Whispers of darker, more unsettling footage have followed the movie for decades, suggesting that the version released may be the safest and least revealing cut. And yet, that tension is precisely why Silent Rage endures. In its fractured identity lies a portrait of a studio wrestling with its own fears. The fear of going too far, the fear of confusing the audience, and the fear of letting a film become exactly what it truly was meant to be. Film 4. Raw Force. 1982. Some movies feel like they were born from a single vision. Raw Force is not one of them. It is a film pulled together by instinct, desperation, and the strange electricity that comes from creating something when no one is entirely sure what it is supposed to be. On the surface, it looked like another exploitation adventure. Martial artists, criminals, cannibals, and even undead warriors colliding on a remote island. It was chaotic, wild, and unapologetically messy, exactly the kind of spectacle early 80 seconds grindhouse audiences expected. But beneath that carnival of madness was a production fighting to stay upright. Director Eddie Romero worked with limited resources, a shifting script, and a cast who often learned about major plot changes moments before the camera rolled. Budgets tightened mid-shoot. Locations shifted without warning. Props were repurposed, sets reimagined, scenes shot in a hurry before someone could ask whether they made narrative sense. Actors described the experience as exhilarating one minute and confusing the next. The marketing promised exotic action and martial arts mayhem, but what emerged was something stranger, a patchwork of genres that somehow managed to feel both accidental and deliberate. The hidden truth lies in those fractures. Entire sequences were rumored to have been cut or rearranged in editing, not for artistic reasons but simply to keep the story moving forward. Different regional releases featured alternate edits, missing scenes, and reordered sequences, leaving no definitive version of the film. Some insiders claimed that a longer cut once existed, one that leaned harder into supernatural elements and explained the island's dark history, though no verifiable copy has ever surfaced. What we have instead is a film that feels like a fever dream, vivid, unstable, and impossible to fully reconstruct. And yet, that instability is its legacy. Raw Force survives not because it was polished, but because its imperfections reveal a deeper truth about filmmaking at the edge of control. It is a reminder that sometimes chaos is not a flaw, but a fingerprint, the proof that the film was fighting to exist at all. Film 5, Invasion US, A 1985. There are action films that aim for spectacle, and then there are films like Invasion USA, where the spectacle grows so large, it nearly swallows the production itself. Released by Canon Films at the height of its ambition, the movie arrived as a blunt force fantasy about foreign terrorists launching a coordinated attack on American soil. A premise designed to provoke, thrill, and spark conversation. Chuck Norris stood at the center as Matt Hunter, the lone force capable of pushing back against an invasion no one saw coming. To audiences, it seemed like another bold entry in the era's wave of patriotic action cinema. But the truth behind the film was far messier. Canon poured resources into Invasion USA, but not with the precision of a studio in control, more with the frantic energy of one trying to outrun its own limitations. Shooting schedules slipped. Stunts were rewritten mid-scene. Entire action sequences were reconfigured in the edit, often to hide continuity issues or missing coverage. Some of the most explosive moments were reportedly filmed only once due to budget constraints, meaning whatever happened on camera, mistakes, improvisations, unexpected reactions became the final version by necessity. The hidden story runs even deeper. Several scenes involving political commentary were allegedly trimmed or softened to avoid unwanted scrutiny. Characters vanished between cuts. Subplots appeared and disappeared. Multiple early edits circulated internally, each attempting to balance spectacle with coherence. Rumors persist of a darker, more intense version of the film, one that leaned harder into the moral implications of a nation under siege. If such a cut ever existed, it has never resurfaced. What remains is a film shaped as much by what was removed as by what stayed in. And yet, Invasion USA endures because of that volatility. Beneath its explosive surface lies a snapshot of a studio at war with time, budget, and expectation. A film that reveals, through its jagged edges, the anxious pulse of 1,980 seconds, action cinema. It is loud, uneven, and ultimately honest in ways it never intended. Bonus fact, The Annihilators, 1985. Some films slip quietly through the cracks of history, not because they failed, but because they revealed more than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The Annihilators is one of those films. A low-budget vigilante story that arrived during the height of America's fascination with urban decay, crime waves, and broken veterans trying to rebuild lives in a world that had stopped listening. On the surface, it was sold as a gritty action thriller about ex-soldiers taking back a neighborhood seized by violence. But underneath that simple pitch lay a production haunted by uncertainty, conflicting tones, and a studio afraid of the film's darker implications. What audiences saw in 1985 was a compact, almost fragmented story. A group of worn-down veterans reunite after the mysterious death of a friend, only to face a gang that feels less like a criminal enterprise and more like a symbol of everything the world ignored. The marketing highlighted the firepower, the explosions, the street battles, the image of warriors returning home only to fight again. But the original script reportedly painted a far more painful portrait of trauma, disillusionment, and the quiet, human cost of endless conflict. Insiders claimed entire dramatic sequences were removed during editing, replaced with action to keep the film commercial. Reshoots reshaped the narrative. Character arcs were shortened or erased. The film's emotional spine, a reflection on veterans abandoned by the very society they defended, was softened until only traces remained. Alternate cuts were rumored to exist, versions that leaned harder into psychological realism, but no surviving copies have ever surfaced. What we have instead is a film caught between two identities: the movie the filmmakers tried to make, and the one the studio believed audiences wanted. And that tension tells its own story. The Annihilators stands as a reminder that some films are not forgotten because they failed, but because they came too close to telling a truth no one was ready to hear. Some films fail on screen, others were never even allowed to fail. In every forgotten reel, there is a moment when the illusion breaks, when the cut is too sharp, the tone shifts too abruptly, or a character moves as if stepping from one unfinished version of the story into another. The 5 films you've just traveled through, along with the one buried inside our bonus fact, all share that same fracture. They were shaped in rooms filled with anxious editors, rewritten in the shadow of producers who feared the truths their directors were inching toward, and stitched together by hands trying to hide the seams. Yet in those seams lies their strange power. These were never meant to be perfect films. They were meant to be products fast, loud, disposable. But somewhere between the rushed shoots, lost footage, abandoned subplots, ghost directors, and altered endings, something unintended slipped through. Honesty. An honesty about how unstable the filmmaking machine can be when fear drives the edits. An honesty about how stories meant to be simple can reveal deeper anxieties when pushed too far. An honesty about how the version you see is rarely the version anyone set out to make. The question that lingers is not whether these films succeeded or failed, but what their scars are trying to tell us. If the cuts could speak, what would they confess? What truths did the missing footage contain? Truths that someone, somewhere, decided were better left in the dark. As you watch these films now, with the distance of decades, you can feel that hidden pulse beneath every mismatched frame. It asks a quiet question. How many other stories were altered, reshaped, or erased before we ever saw them? And more importantly, how many still are?